Welcome back to part two of our discussion of Augustine's City of God. We're using his concept that ended up at the end of part one saying there's these two ethics that are applied. One person is a city of this kingdom or this city, and yet if you're a Christian, you're also a citizen of heaven. And so sometimes you have to use your individual ethic that Jesus teaches you, which is to turn the other cheek, love your enemy. You do that as an individual, internally, privately. But then there is, beyond the individual ethic, a public ethic. You have to defend others because it's the loving thing to do. So, what might be the alternative to Augustine's view? Well, we're going to look at 5 different alternatives. I'm going to run through these really quickly just so that we sort of know what our choices are. And I want to be clear up front that I'm not doing justice to any of these views that I represent. I'm not going to be able to accurately represent all the different nuances that should be put in place for these. I just want us to sort of have these general options, and I trust that you will go and look further and investigate these options on your own to see maybe there is something to offer there. But we're going to compare them with Augustine's option of 2 cities. So let's see what those 5 are. Okay, our first alternative is the concept of 2 swords. Now, this really is not going to be one that we consider much today, but I just want to list it because Luther, the second option, is going to be responding specifically to this. And it comes from the scene where Jesus is arrested. Peter says, look, there are 2 swords here. Jesus says it is enough. And when you have these 2 swords approved by Jesus, the medieval West tended to think that there was one given to the church to excommunicate you, but then that church worked hand in hand with the state, and the second sword could execute you. So it's the coordination of these 2. And again, there's much more to be said about how the popes thought they were in charge of the emperors and vice versa, but that history doesn't need to bog us down for now, because as I said, this really isn't going to be much of an option that we consider at the present. Okay, the second option we want to consider is Luther's view of the 2 kingdoms. And this is going to be very close to Augustine's option. In fact, Luther thinks he's doing the exact same thing as Augustine, and at times he is. So in these 2 kingdoms, we're thinking along the exact same lines of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. And the human leader of the kingdom of earth is ordained by God. And there are Bible verses to back this up, even in the New Testament. And so Luther thinks you should obey the kingdom of earth wherever possible. And yet there are times where it seems like the kingdom of heaven's ethic is different for the individual. So he has that individual ethic versus that public ethic, just like Augustine. So for the most part of our discussion today, we could think of the 2 kingdoms and the 2 cities as very much alike. But now there is, I think, a stronger criticism of Luther's view. And again, this may not be fair to Luther himself, but at least the way Luther is read and interpreted later, is Luther seems to put this less in terms of love and that internal motivation, and more in terms of one's role and duty. So if your duty is to obey God whenever possible, you should. And if God has placed people in authority over you, then you should obey them as part of your duty to God. And that means if someone who's your king commands you to do something, you obey that king. Now, again, Luther is not quite going to say it this bluntly, but the problem gets into, well, does that mean you have to obey every order, even an unjust order? And I mean, the most horrific instances of this was in Nazi Germany, where people were using an ethic that said, sure, privately as a Christian, I would say love these Jewish people in our country, but publicly, I'm a soldier, and my commanding officer told me to ... Well, it's clear afterwards in the Nuremberg trials and others that you can't simply blame your sense of duty or obeying a commanding officer. There is still a stronger ethic that must overrule this. And Luther, I think, would be able to answer this charge. Augustine certainly has a stronger emphasis on the loving motive that is behind both ethics, the individual and the public. Whereas Luther is heard as saying it's really a sense of duty to the public kingdom of earth as well as the kingdom of heaven. Okay, now there were many in the Protestant Reformation who thought they were following Luther to his logical conclusion. The radical reformers, or so-called Anabaptists, And many of these had this radical label because they wanted to, part of that was they wanted to radically follow Jesus' teachings. And things in the Sermon on the Mount were to be followed at all times. And they would say the same thing that Peter would say in Acts, that we must obey the laws of God rather than the laws of men or human authorities. So if this is true, then even if your human authority orders you to kill someone, say in war, you should not obey that human authority. You should obey Jesus' authority, who tells you to turn the other cheek and love your enemy at all times. There is no division of ethics. There is single ethic at all times. So they're generally pacifists. And when you start to see how does this consistently apply, can you always live out as a Christian and never take an oath, so you can't be in public office? Does this mean that you somehow retreat from society and you end up setting up sort of a separate society ruled by the kingdom rules of heaven because you can't really participate in the kingdom rules of earth? Now, again, that's not fair. There are many ways that people from this Anabaptist tradition have found ways to negotiate in larger society. But you see the criticism, the tendency that might be there is that you are a withdrawn society because you simply can't even live according to the kingdoms of this world's standards. Okay, so when we get into the modern era, there are theologians, specifically from the Protestant tradition, who are trying to answer all of these debates from Luther, from the Anabaptist tradition, and they think that they should actually carry out a single ethic. But it should be a single ethic that's not a retreat or a separate ethic, not a withdrawing from society. It's an engaging in society. And you go out into the public sphere with this single ethic. You still obey Jesus no matter what he says to do. And if he says to love your neighbor as yourself, you should do it. And if he says to care for those who are in need and the poor, you should do it, even in a public sense, not just this private attempt to say, I would privately give money to the poor, but the government, the public, does not need to care for the poor. The social gospel thinkers like Walter Rauschenbusch and others, they're going to say, no, we should take this ethic that Jesus gives us as individuals, and we should take it with us into the voting booth. Caesar has given us the vote, and we represent the public, and so we should take this single ethic, but now it's moved beyond the individual, and it's not going to retreat from society. It's going to try to transform society. Okay, fifth and last option we're going to list here for today is that specifically articulated by Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr is articulating a view that really is not new, but he gives it new nuance, and he's able to respond to those views who came before him. And he goes back to this idea that the attempt to really make the world a transformed society doesn't work. So the social gospel is his main, he's critical of them more than any others. But at the same time, he doesn't want to have a retreatist, separatist society like the Anabaptists. He wants to get back to something like what Luther had. He thinks he's being faithful to Luther and to Augustine. But he has categories to help him. He's going to say that if you do have to fight a war, we're not going to call it just in the sense of righteous. It's not really righteous to kill people because Jesus clearly told us not to. But he says even though it's not just, it's not exactly unjust either. Because if you just let innocent people be killed and you could have stopped them, that's unjust. So he thinks that there is this extra category between the just and the unjust, and it's the category of being necessary. You see, the ultimate ethic that Jesus gives us is one of loving our neighbor, turning the other cheek, never doing harm to others. That's the ultimate category. But there's what he calls the penultimate, the just before the end. And in this just before the end, it's a fallen world. And he thinks we're just going to have to admit that at times we have to play according to these fallen rules. And we have to do things like kill people. But we never say it's good. We never say it's right or just. We say it's necessary. So we do it, and we repent for it, but we had to do it. Now, people in the Anabaptist tradition simply don't buy this. They say you don't have to. Just sacrifice yourself and trust God. And people in the social gospel are going to do the same. Of course, we try to transform society. And yes, it's a fallen world, but we're ambassadors of the kingdom of heaven. And it's our job to bring about kingdom ethics on earth. And then, of course, the two kingdom ethic is simply going to say, Augustine would have this idea of two cities as this isn't just necessary and you confess your sins here. You don't have to confess a sin. You don't have to say sorry. You don't have to think of it as only necessary. He's going to say it's good because it's a loving thing to do. Okay, now we've seen our options. Is Augustine's two cities ethics, two ethics, going to be the right way to go? Or do we go to something like a Anabaptist or a social gospel or maybe something else? Well, if we look at some case studies, that will help us test drive some of these theories. So I hope you'll come back to the third part where we'll do exactly that. Politics. For Augustine, the sort of original sin that we experience, put you in the cord, you're going to get electrocuted.